Chapter 9 Treaty Feast. The bright blast of a herald's trumpet sounded from the great hall throughout the keep of the Tambluff Castle. The hour of the treaty feast had come. Across the courtyard, Aidan was admiring the new robe his father had given him for the occasion. He had never worn such finery. The bright blue cloth was thick and heavy between his thumb and finger, but soft and so smooth that it shone with a satiny sheen. The cloth was woven from cotton grown on Longleaf Manor and dyed with indigo grown only a few feet from the spot where the Errolsons had captured Samson. But these robes were a far cry from the rough, homespun cloth that the Errolsons were used to. Errol straightened Percy's robe on his shoulders, then stepped back to admire his 5 sons. "Look at you," he said, half whispering. "The flower of Cornwall. I only wish your mother were here to see you. Grown men all." Errol bit his lip and turned quickly away from them toward the door of the apartment. "The feast is beginning. We should go." Stepping into the courtyard from the stairwell, Aidan and his brothers were astonished at the sight of what they took to be a parade of Perthyn nobles making their way toward the great hall. They were dressed in richer clothes than the Errolsons had ever seen, richer even than the robes King Daro wore when he visited Longleaf. The Errolsons' robes were made of the finest cotton, but the other feast-goers were dressed in silk, satin, velvet, even fur, though it was a blistering midsummer's day. The courtyard was a riot of color as the evening sun glinted off the shiny satin and silken robes of red, pink, yellow, blue, green, orange, and purple. The sleeves of the noblemen's gowns were so voluminous that their richly embroidered cuffs nearly dragged the paving stones of the courtyard. Behind the great men trailed yards of extra fabric, in some cases carried by servants so it wouldn't drag. Their heavy gold chains clinked like tinker wagons when they walked. Their extravagant dress was downright comical. But the Errolsons soon realized that these men weren't Perthens at all. As they stepped into the courtyard, they began to recognize faces in the crowd. Lord Selwyn, Lord Bretumel, Lord Halberd, and his 3 sons. These were Cornwalders. Suddenly, the Errolsons, in their close-fitting, unadorned, blue robes, felt underdressed for the occasion. "Father," called Maynard in a loud whisper. Errol was 2 strides ahead of them, making straight across the courtyard, without looking to his left or right. "Father, are you sure we're dressed the way we're supposed to be?" Errol spun around to answer his son. He spoke through clenched teeth. "We were invited to a treaty feast, not a costume party. We are dressed as Cornwalders. If our countrymen wish to preen like Perthens, that is their business and none of ours." He turned back and continued his march to the great hall, his step a little brisker than before. The great hall was larger than Aidan had imagined. From end to end, it was 35 strides of a grown full man, and from side to side, 20 man strides or more. The flames of 40 torches set in the massive walls hardly provided enough light for such an enormous space, but they lent a rich glow to the honey-brown sandstone. The ceiling vaulted up out of sight, obscured by darkness and torch smoke. The fireplace was piled with logs that would each require 2 strong men to carry, but no fire blazed on this hot, muggy night. The walls were adorned with skillfully woven tapestries depicting great moments in Cornwall's history. Radnor's charge at Bureen, the burning of the Perthyn fleet at Middenmarsh, the sieges of Tambluff. Interspersed between the tapestries were Daro's hunting trophies, boar's heads, massive elk antlers, bear skins, turkey fans. A line of 7 tables placed end to end ran down the middle of the great hall. The Cornwalders, dressed in all their finery, were finding seats on the benches that ran down either side of the table. The Errolsons sat with their father near the foot of the table. At the head of the room, beneath a massive stained glass window, was the dais, a raised platform like a long stage running across the width of the room. On the dais was sat the table of honor, one very long table made of polished walnut with carved chairs rather than benches. 2 dozen wax candles on 6 golden candelabras provided a bright, clear light that stood in distinct contrast to the murkiness elsewhere in the hall. All eyes turned towards the dais when a trumpet flourish rang out above the chatter of the feasters. The guests of honor, the 8 members of the Perthan delegation, were just entering. They were led by Daro's royal steward, a short, round man with a white beard, who showed them to their places, 4 seats on either side of the middle chair, which was reserved for Daro himself. The Perthans were tall and very handsome. They were dressed more or less like the Cornwalders, in silks and satins, with exquisite embroideries and embedded jewels that glistened in the candlelight. But they carried their finery with an elegance that made the Cornwalders' attempt at imitation seem all the more clownish. Earlier, Aidan had felt embarrassed for having dressed in the old Cornwalder style. Now he was glad that father had chosen not to ape the Perthans' dress. A bugler standing at the edge of the dais sounded a short tucket, and all rose to greet the entering king. Daro looked splendid, a paragon of the Cornwalder manhood. He stood over 6 feet tall, and even though he was close to 60, his back was as straight as it had ever been, and his stride as sure. His royal blue robe, embroidered with the golden boar of the house of Daro, was more ornate than the Errolsons' robes, but not nearly as extravagant as those of the Perthans or the other Cornwalders. A small and simple crown sat on his grayish head. His black eyes shone beneath eyebrows that were still as black as they had been in his youth. His silver beard was neatly trimmed along the square line of his jaw, and his lips, though closed, showed the slightest hint of a smile. When the king was seated, another trumpet sounded, and the head waiter entered the room balancing a huge haunch of roast beef on a tray. He was a short and skinny man in a white apron. He could hardly have weighed more than the enormous piece of meat he hoisted over his head, but his look of calm solemnity was undisturbed by any sign of strain as he mounted the dais steps and placed the tray in front of the king. All eyes were on Daro as he took a large carving knife. It looked more like a small sword, and carved 8 hand-thick slices of beef, one for each of his foreign guests. The head waiter placed a slice on each Perthan's plate, and Daro stood to offer a prayer of thanks for the feast. But even as the king stood, the Perthans began cutting and eating their meat. Reluctant to embarrass his guests, Daro signaled to the servants, who stood in the wings. Then he sat back down without speaking. Servants began bringing in bowls and platters in what seemed to be an endless procession. The first course was a stew made of eels pulled from the River Tam, followed by smoked perch from the northern shires of Cornwall, steamed mackerels from the coast near Middenmarsh, haunches of venison, hams of wild boar, and roasted herons with their beautiful plumage still on. In between were pastries and meat pies, peaches, melons, toasted pecans, figs, and oranges, brought in by the wagon load from the southernmost reaches of the island. As the feasters were stuffing themselves, strolling lutesmen played and sang favorite Cornwalder ballads. Acrobats tumbled and wrestled and staged mock combats to the delight of the assembled onlookers. One of the entertainers juggled 2 live chickens while squeezing his body through a cheese hoop. After the cheeses and the wafers had been served, the court jester tootled a mock flourish on a little tin horn and strode into the great hall, balancing a huge meat pie on a tray over his head. Wearing a white apron over his green and yellow patchwork costume, he was a full version of the head waiter. With his chin lifted, his eyebrows raised above half-closed eyelids, and his mouth pulled down into a solemn frown, he mimicked the head waiter's air of importance. But his solemnity was betrayed by his fool's cap, which flopped into his face with every step. Its brass bell jingled as it bumped his nose. The feasters roared with laughter, but the jester's look of self-importance never cracked. The assembly watched eagerly as the jester strode toward the long center table. He stumbled, and the audience gasped as a huge meat pie teetered and nearly dropped on the white head of Lord Cuthbert, the eldest of the 24. But the jester, in an amazing feat of agility, recovered his balance and rescued both the meat pies and Lord Cuthbert. Pacing up and down the table, the jester looked into the face of each feaster. He was seeking out the youngest member of the assembly. It appeared that he would settle on Prince Sturin, the only son of King Daro. But then he spotted Aidan, and he tripped his way to the far end of the hall. In the same ceremonious way, the head waiter had placed the beef roast in front of King Daro. The jester set the meat pie in front of Errol's youngest son, presenting Aidan with an oversized butter knife. The jester recited a poem. The youngest feaster at the board is just a sprout of a greater lord. Some day he may carve the roast on high, today the humble pigeon pie. Your sovereign dish is somewhat bigger, but yours you'll find has much more vigor. So slice the pie and send it round, that mirth and good cheer might abound. Aidan took the big knife from the jester. He didn't exactly follow the jester's meaning, especially the part about his pie being more vigorous than the king's dish. But he could see he was supposed to cut slices of the pigeon pie, as King Daro had cut slices of the beef roast. When the knife broke the top pastry, the pie made a noise, a trilling coo like a pigeon. Aidan drew back in surprise, and the gray head of a pigeon popped out of the hole the knife had made. Two lively little birds' eyes fixed on Aidan's face. The small round head bobbed forward and back 2 times. Then the pie exploded in a shower of crumbs and bits of pastry as the pigeons burst out of the pie and took flight, followed by a dozen more pigeons. They whirred away in a gray blur over Aidan's head and out into the courtyard. The feasters howled at Aidan's shocked expression and at the jester's cleverness in devising a pigeon coat disguised as a pigeon pie. It took Aidan a minute to catch his breath, but when he had, he laughed as heartily as anyone in the room.